What we'll do tonight is we'll start us off with karakia just to bring us all into the space, and then I'll get into Waimahi and on our way. So, me karakia tātou. Ko te kawa o runga, ko te kawa o raro, ko te kawa ora, ko te kawa ora. E rongo whakairia ki runga, turuturu whiti whakamawa kia tīna. Hui e tae ki e. O tēnā koutou katoa, tihei mauri ora. E ngā mana e ngā reo e rau rangatira mā. Haere mai ki runga e te kaupapa o te rā. Karanga mai ki te kaupapa o te rā. Kia hui tahi ai tātou tēnei rā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko horohoro i ngā o ngā ringa o ka tūma te moimoi te maunga, ko pokaitu te awa, ko Ngāti Kia, Ngāti Tuara mā, me Ngāti Whakaue te hapu, ko Ngāti Tuara no tēnei maka no ko te hirangi hoki o ku tupuna, ko Kiriro te marae, ko te awa te iwi, ko Hansins and Value and Tuku Ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here tonight. My name is Hansins and and I'm the program lead for the Master of Change in Organisational Resilience and the Postgrad Certificate in Leading Change for Good at Academy X. I hail from Rotorua and whakapapa to Te Arawa, Scotland, Denmark, just to name a few. Something about me, I'm neurodivergent. I have dyslexia ADHD, so please forgive if I get a few words wrong here or there, but I'm sure you'll work with me on that. On the call tonight, we have from Academy X, we have Jana Prudence, our wonderful marketing manager, Lisa Whittington-Slater, our outreach manager, and we have our wonderful guest speaker, Steven Moe, with us tonight, who I will introduce to you shortly. So the plan for tonight is to go over some housekeeping and to get into welcoming Steven to the floor, where Steven and I will have an interactive discussion on reimagining business, and then we'll have some time for your questions that you may want to ask Steven as well. We want to keep this reasonably organic, so if you do have a burning question as we're going through the discussion, please just pop it in the chat, and we will see if we can answer that more quickly. This event is hosted by Academy X. It's part of our Leading Change for Good series. The audio is part of the Seeds podcast, which I'll explain in a second. So I'll just go over to the Zoom housekeeping. This session will be recorded, just to FYI, and will be sent out via email tomorrow for those who registered to the event, along with the slide deck. Please keep, we're also recording this audio for Steven's Seed podcast, and if you haven't seen that, you can go ahead and check that out. We'll pop that link in the chat, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we introduce Steven as well. Could you please keep yourself on mute unless you are invited to speak, have a question to ask, and please use the chat function in the interim for asking questions. There is some dedicated time for question and answers at the end of this, and we of course love to see your smiling faces, and so please turn your video on if you are able as part of this interactive session. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Steven Moe, who holds multiple hats within spaces he walks within. He's a lawyer by trade, a partner at Field Lawyers in Christchurch, with a focus on startups and small business and purpose-driven entities, helping them succeed through practical support on topics such as structures, raising capital, and IP. Steven also hosts the podcast that I just mentioned, Seeds, where he has interviewed over 350 people who are living their lives of purpose. He's an author of Social Enterprise in New Zealand and Reimagining Business, distilling insights from his podcasts, his work, and his passions about the future of business. Today, our discussion will focus on what would we design if we could reconsider the role of business without our preconceptions and start over. In this interactive talk, Steven will share about the limitations inherent in our current structure options, how business can still enshrine the impact despite those shortcomings, and what the future might hold if we really did imagine the role of business within a 100-year perspective. In preparation for this conversation, I have listened to many of these podcasts and essays that you have posted, Steven. I'm intrigued by you and your story. So I'd like to start the conversation focused on your journey With the programs at Academy X, we recognise the importance of lived experience that you bring with you and how this shapes your identity, your contribution to your context, your work, your family, your social events, etc. We recognise this experience can and will shape our actions going forward from a child to the workplace and other contexts. We construct actions and reactions from these past experiences and apply these to our new ones. This can limit our ability to see things differently, to adopt other perspectives, or to change. Having vulnerability to share part of your story can enable rich connections, inspiration, and support for people to overcome some of our own limiting behaviors and mindsets. So, without further ado, Stephen, I'd like to ask, who are you? You have an interesting accent. It's always a good conversation starter, but tell me a little bit more about your upbringing and what's led you to be who you are today. So, welcome, Stephen.
Oh, well, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Tēnā koutou katoa no America ho no te temetanga, ko te taita toku manga, ko waitaki toku awa, ko ototahi toku kainga ina nei, e roia toku tunga mahi o Perryfield Lawyers, ko Steven Moe toku ingoa, no reira ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this event because I feel like the people who've joined this call are probably already part of my tribe. So thank you for being here, all of you, whether you're watching right now or if you're watching a recording or listening to it later on Seed's podcast. So yeah, your question, I always feel like I need to explain a little bit in that I do have an accent. But you always have to be careful with accents. You can't judge people necessarily on what you think they would be. So in my case, I moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand when I was 7 years old. That was way back in 1984. My father was a marine biologist, kind of an unusual profession, and he was an expert in raising salmon. So the salmon industry didn't exist in the early 1980s. So he came in from America and helped to start that as an industry here. So that brought them actually down in Otago on the Waitaki River. That was where we moved to a small place called Papakayo. And I was in what at the time was Standard 3. If any of you remember the old standards, Standard 3 and 4, we were in one classroom, about 20 children together. So a very small rural place. And then my parents moved us in 1989. We moved to Christchurch, Otatahi. So I grew up here in the South Island in Otatahi. I went to Canterbury University. And I think for me, I've always had a feeling of, where am I from? Turanga Waiwai. I look at the mountains, the Port Hills. There's just a feeling for me that it's this place. So this is where I feel very connected. And I've moved around a lot, but this is the place where I can drive somewhere and I won't be able to tell you the street names, but I'll get you there. I know it well enough that that's how I feel. So after graduating from Canterbury University, I started work at a law firm called Russell McVeigh in Wellington. And I spent 3 years there and I met my wife there who's English. So we actually spent another 3 years in London. And then I speak some Japanese, so they sent me to the Tokyo office. And then after the Tokyo office, 4 years there, I moved to Sydney. And with 4 young children who came home singing the Australian national anthem, we realized it was time to reconsider where we were living. So we moved back here 7 years ago. So my story, my career, if you like, is one of different objectives or purposes, because the first half of my career was very much focused on corporates and banks, very large scale deals. The law firm I worked for had 3,800 lawyers. 3,800 lawyers in one firm, 55 offices. So my background is very big end of town, billion-pound deals. And so when I arrived back here, I really wanted to reinvent my career to be focused on the principles of impact and purpose. So now I'm helping corporates and companies, but usually they're purpose-driven, and profit is part of what they do so that they can be sustainable. And as well as that, I'm helping a lot of charities and helping them set up. And we'll get into the dynamics there of how those worlds interact, but that's a little bit of my history.
Awesome, Stephen, and thanks for that. And it sounds really rich in terms of, yeah, from salmon farming and the intricacies of that to big shot law firms. Definitely a twist and turn in terms of yeah, sort of focus and living. I guess I've heard you ask this a few times on some of your podcasts, but what was the 7-year-old Stephen like? What were you like when you were 7 years old?
Oh, that's a great question. It's nice to have the question reversed. As you mentioned, I've done 356 interviews now. So that's usually my opening question with the guest is, what was life like when you were 5 years old? So I guess my 7-year-old self, it was a time of transition. You know, I was arriving in a new country and still working out where I fit in the scheme of things. I think I've always had kind of a curious bent. My mother taught me a principle which I still live by. And she told me one time, if you meet someone and you don't think that they're interesting, that's not their fault. It's on you, because that means you haven't asked the right question yet. So she is a very inquisitive, curious person. And so I learned from her this idea that every person has a story and a journey. And so we need to be reaching out and asking questions. And unfortunately, with the dominance of screens and attention spans, we just don't spend enough time talking with each other and really going a little bit deeper than the surface of, you know, what's the weather like where you are? So yeah, I'd say that was a bit about who I was. That curiosity was there. After living in New Zealand, we did move to Chile as well. So I learned to speak Spanish when I was 8 or 9 years old. And I think that opened up my world. Having another language, I think it causes you to realize that the world isn't a rigid place, that there may be more than one way to describe bread, you know? It could be bread, it could be pan. It's the same. So I think that was who I was as a young child.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, nice little window into some of those experiences that really do shape how you walk through life, I guess, in the future as well. So what I touched on in there, bit of the opening there. So if we move into this topic for reimagining business, what inspired you to write about this topic? You've mentioned around purpose and impact, but you want to tell me a little bit more about why you decided to write these essays?
Yeah, no problem. And I'm going to hold this up so people can see it, and we'll send a link to it. It's a free download for anybody who's interested. And as you say, it's a series of essays that I wrote for Stuff and Spinoff and other places, really questioning what the future of business could be. And I guess the answer, in a way, I don't want to leave my parents just yet, because they had a profound influence on me, as all of our parents do. I was really lucky that my parents, in the 1960s, they volunteered for something called the Peace Corps. So some of you may have heard of that. And the Peace Corps is basically sending young Americans out, like whatever your perceptions of America is, this is one of the bright spots. They were sending young graduates out to countries to help people. So my father was working to set up cooperatives of fishermen in southern Chile, and my mother was working in Santiago. That's where they met. And I think that background from them, it's always been this questioning of, well, why is it the way it is? And if there's injustice, then what could we do? So from my perspective, having worked in the big corporate law firm, I really was focusing on how I can reinvent who I am and what I focus on. So in 2017, some of you may remember that the Social Enterprise World Forum was held in Christchurch. So I had just arrived back in the country, and this became something that I could hang my hat on. So I wrote a book called Social Enterprise in New Zealand, a legal handbook. And that was when I started the podcast as well. And I guess the answer to your question is, I kept meeting entrepreneurs and people who wanted to push the boundaries of what was possible, but felt like they were speaking a different language, and that the language, the terminology that would normally be used when it comes to business, words like profit, quarterly reporting, expansion, that wasn't resonating with the principles that they wanted to bring to business. So it was really a response to meeting these amazing people who were using different vocabulary and realizing that, hey, as a lawyer, I can be a catalyst for change because I can help them to set things up that are done in a different way, under a new paradigm of thinking of what the role of business could be.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephen. And I think it really gives a bit of, I guess, feeling and insight in terms of how these essays came together and what we were thinking at the time. And you just mentioned the paradigm shift in terms of thinking, and that notion of positive impact taking precedence over that traditional profit center approach. And that's quite a big one across the globe. But as we see, there are lots of shifts in the space. But how is it crucial now? Why this conversation? What's needed?
Well, I want to start. So let's jump in a little time machine. Okay, let's go back 250 years. Did companies exist? Not in the way we think of them. Like, we invented them as a human species. We invented this thing called a company. So if we were to go back in time, the way it worked is, if you had an idea, if you were an entrepreneur, you wanted to set up a bakery. Like, I don't know if anybody here, if their surname is Baker, maybe their great grandparents were bakers. And so if you did that and it didn't work out, you lost everything. So the company is a fictional creation which exists to promote entrepreneurship, because it limits liability for entrepreneurs. So if I set up the bakery and it doesn't work out, I'm not going to lose everything. The company will go into liquidation, and sure, I'll have reputation damage, but I'm not going to lose everything, usually. So companies, the point is that companies didn't exist in the past. Like, go back 1,000 years, there's no companies. We invented them in the relatively recent history. So if we invented them, then if we got a blank piece of paper out and we're inventing them again, would we invent them the same way? And my answer to that would be no, we would not. We would not invent them the same way. And so therefore, if they're fictions, and if we invented them, and if we see structural ways that they could be improved, then we should be working as hard as we can today to reinvent the form of company, so that we have something that in 100 years' time or 200 years' time will actually be generative and actually not extractive. And I think for me, that's the lens that I'm using on everything today. Like, we have short lifespans. One of my hopes is, I'm not going to do this forever. I would hope that I can pass the baton to the next generation of lawyers coming up who can continue the work that we're doing today. But that maybe, just maybe 100 years from now, someone will stumble across this recording and say, wow, look what they were talking about in 2023. They had the foresight and the vision to realize that they needed to think in a new way about the role of a company, and that there were some key tweaks to the company structure that were needed to really bring a new conception for the future. So that's kind of my thinking on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And it's really interesting you say a new perspective, but some of the concepts that you talk about, and particularly in essay 4, you mention the importance of kaitiakitanga, te ao Māori, and the Māori worldview in terms of the way that we can navigate in the future. And if we think about that more holistic model, before capitalization, before we moved into this systems and structures that we have within education, within society, within all aspects. It's more of a, is it a more of a move forward, or is it looking to some more models that have been upheld in the past, because now we've got a focus on that regeneration rather than, as someone said, not extractive?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This is the thing, there's the old saying, there's nothing new under the sun, like that's true to a certain extent. And I think if we do look, this is where I think we have the opportunity here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think that we can be world leading because we have a richness and a depth which comes from a proper conception of Te Ao Māori. So that's why in the essay and in other parts of that little book, I talk quite a lot about things like stewardship and kaitiakitanga and intergenerational well-being, like that. So often from a Western conception, we're talking from an individualistic perspective, me, I'm the hero of this story. Whereas actually if you look at it from a Te Ao Māori perspective, it would be more of a community focus. So I think that we have an incredible richness that we can draw from and learn from. One of the key things, particularly as a Pākehā, is that I'm not meaning this in a tokenistic or in a colonizing of concepts ways. I'm talking about a deep and rich understanding of these principles and concepts. So that's really important to clarify, because when I talk about this with people offshore, they might just say, oh, well, great, this thing called kaitiakitanga, I'm going to copy paste it and that's it. But we have to go a lot deeper than that and have a real richness to it. But the point is that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, if we could do this well, and I think we could, because we're small enough, we're nimble enough, after the shootings here in Christchurch, there were changes made to gun laws and it went through, look at America, it just doesn't happen. So if we could come up with a solution for what the future of companies could be, and we adopted it here, then I think we could be the template that every other country looks at and says, look at what they're doing over there. We should try that. We should adopt what they've done because somehow they've been successful. The other thing is that other countries have tried to do some of the things that we're going to get into the detail of. So it's not like we can't say we're world leading. I know we always like to say that, but the reality is that in the UK, they introduced something called the Community Interest Company, like more than a decade ago. It's been there for a long time. But what I would say is we can learn from Italy, the UK, Canada, the US, where they've introduced first generation models of corporate structures. And we could leapfrog over those models to get to a third generation model that actually improved on everything that had been done before. And that's one reason, like I wrote the book, Social Enterprise in New Zealand, a legal handbook, but I've actually moved away from the term social enterprise. The reason is that I prefer now talking about impact enterprises or impact companies. And that's the terminology that I think we should potentially adopt here, because then we're differentiating ourselves from what's been done using that terminology of social enterprise in other parts of the world. And I think we have an amazing opportunity there to lead the way, like a world leading change rather than stepping in the shoes of other people. Because I'm not sure that I want what is done as social enterprise offshore to be what we do. I want us to reinvent the concepts so that they don't just apply to those people over there who are social enterprises. I want it to pervade all 750,000 companies that exist in New Zealand as a concept that all of them get on board with.
That's really, really interesting in terms of that terminology. And I'd really love you to just sort of go a little bit deeper in terms of the why you are saying that from the term social enterprise and what that means to others offshore, and a little bit more about what you mean by impact enterprise and what the differences would really be.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I love these topics, and thank you everybody for joining to listen to this because it's really fun for me. So for me, it's just a terminology point. I think the words that we use matter. I'm going to go on a slight divergence, but I think you'll appreciate it. So the term not-for-profit, how many of you have used that or seen that? If we think about that as a parallel to what we're talking about, not-for-profit, why do we use that term? First of all, it starts with a negative. An entire sector is painted by what it is not. And what is it comparing to? It is not for profit, as if profit was the ultimate aim of our entities. So I think the terminology not for profit is going down the wrong road. So I've been advocating for a new term, which is for purpose organizations. So that's when it comes to charities. So I'm just giving you an example of the fact that the words we use matter. And I think for purpose would be better than not for profit. So when it comes to social enterprise, I have used the word a lot. I'm finishing a book right now where I only use it once, and I say I'm not going to use this term in the book, and I explain why. So you'll be able to read that pretty soon. My first title for that is The Impact Tree Paradigm, Reimagining Business. It's kind of a follow-up to this one here. But anyway, the term social enterprise, the first thing is social. Like, what do we mean by social? Because social in its own concept, it's kind of a limited term. Like, does social include environmental? Is environmental, that's not quite social, is it? It's related, but it's not exactly the same. So I feel like the term impact is like a bigger umbrella that sits over more. So social, cultural, environmental, financial, like these are all terms that we want to be having in our conception. So that's why I've been preferring the term impact company or impact enterprise, just because I think it is a broader conception of what we're talking about. And I think it's actually something, like I said before, I just worry. I've been to a lot of conferences, right? And I've talked with people from big companies. And as soon as I use the word social enterprise, they're like kind of dismissive, to be honest. They're like, oh yeah, that's what those people do over there. You know, like it's not something that would apply to my multi-million-dollar company. Whereas actually, I think we need to be encouraging every company to be adopting the principles that sit beneath social enterprise. So the two key changes that I would see implemented, the first one is that in New Zealand, we do not require companies to adopt a constitution when they begin. And I think that's a mistake. I think that what we should be requiring is that every company has a constitution. So that's a public-facing document. Anyone can find it. Anyone can download it. And not only do I think companies should have a constitution, I think they should be required to articulate their mission or their purpose in the constitution, not as clause 27 on the back page, but actually right up front and center, like cause number 1, this company exists too, and then actually force people to say what that is. So I'm working with a company right now, and we are designing their constitution. And the opening phrase of this constitution is a very challenging one. It says, this company exists to serve Mother Earth. This company exists to serve Mother Earth. So it's conceiving the role of the company, not from a Milton Friedman perspective of shareholder primacy and extraction of profit, but instead placing it within the scheme of the earth itself. So not every company, that wouldn't be appropriate for every company, but for some companies, it will be appropriate. And I think if you look at a company like Kind Cafe up in Morningside in Auckland, you know, I helped them draft their constitution, and that talks about the role of that company being to foster community in that particular location. So that's kind of the first thing that I think would be really helpful. I realize that not every company is going to want to, you know, do this. And I see the note in the chat, would this add to more compliance? But my perspective would be, we should at least have the conversation. And then I think if companies wanted to do this and adopt a constitution and they were clear on their impact, then we could have a subset of companies that were called impact companies. They could qualify for that status. And then more people might be aware of it and start to think about, what are we doing and why do we do it? So that would be the first thing. The second thing is, I would like to require companies to report on their impact and what they're actually doing. Because I think there's a big disconnect right now between the greenwashing that's probably happening, the social washing of people saying one thing and doing another. So those are some initial reactions to your question.
Yeah, again, thank you for that, Stephen. And in terms of the terminology and how important that is to have those discussions, I think there are a very loaded set of ideals that come with some of those names, and particularly not-for-profit is definitely one, and we hear that and use that quite a lot here, as you say, but also that a lot of these not-for-profit organizations are struggling in terms of structures and support and finance and being able to survive in the world that they're within, and so we might have a lot of people wanting to do good in the community, wanting to give back into the community, but are really finding some constraints in terms of being able to do so effectively. So have you got any thoughts on that?
I do. I think about this a lot, and one of the things that I want to be clear about is that each of us are like fish in the fishbowl. So what I mean by that is that you don't even know that you're breathing water if you're a goldfish, right? Like that's just the way it is. And it's the same for each of you listening. We grew up with a conception, which is kind of a binary way of thinking, which is if you're going to do good, you set up a charity. If you're going to make money, you set up a company. And so that binary conception has infected the way that we think about things. So one of the things that I'm doing a lot of right now is helping people to understand that it doesn't have to be a binary thing. You know, like if you're talking to someone and they say, I'm going to set up a cafe, your mind immediately is thinking, oh, you're going to get some investors, there's going to be some profit, you're going to need some loans from the bank. If you talk to someone and they say, I'm going to help people who've just been released from prison, you're probably thinking, oh, someone's going to donate you money, and where are you going to get your source of funding for the charity that you're going to set up? And the new way, the merging that happens is, I'm going to set up a cafe that employs people who used to be prisoners. So you're actually fulfilling a mission and a purpose at the same time as having a viable business. So that's just the conception, the blending or the merging of what's going on when it comes to the thinking. And then what I'm also helping a lot of people with is charities realizing that they could set up a company that would actually advance their purpose. And so helping them set up a commercial business that is profitable. And then I'm also helping a lot of companies set up charities, because there are funding streams and things which are available that are available for charities, but not for businesses. So as an example, just to make it really practical, I've got a client who's doing amazing work as a building company. They employ hundreds of people, they build houses. They're really good at what they do. Even in what they do, they do a lot of social housing and building housing of that type. But the founder said to me, is there other things that we could be doing? And we brainstormed, and basically they've set up a charity. And so the charity is about education around poverty alleviation through providing housing. So the charity and the business are working together to achieve the outcomes, rather than it needing to be, well, I'll go make as much money as I can, so then I can gift it to a charity. So there's, I guess what I'm saying is that there is a greater understanding that hybrid solutions are increasingly possible if you have a bigger conception beyond just the binary way of thinking.
Do you think that there are, I mean, you've talked about greenwashing and sort of ticking the boxes along the way. And if you are a profit-driven organization, and I think there's definitely some examples out there of this in play at the moment, and we have an arm that sort of gives back to a community, but in essence, overall, the harm that's been done by the profit-driving side of the business is not sustainable in terms of that, but yet are getting benefits for having that we give back, which is not, quite enough to even be in that space. Because ethically, if we're talking about, setting up an impact and looking at something that is for good in the for good space or for purpose space, and it's looking after our earth, number one, and people, and then going down into the profits, What's your take on that, and how do we transition away from that as a bit of an offset model?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think part of the answer is that the solutions don't come instantly. And we have to get out of a conception of it's going to happen next year. The transitions take time, unfortunately. But the more people that attend this type of a call or have these sorts of discussions, the better, because then more people are going to be out rousing debate within their companies saying, is what we're doing, are we really just social washing? You know, like, is this really just a marketing spend to get more money so that we can keep producing the widget, which is made of plastic and is, you know, destroying our earth? So I think it's a legitimate question, but I guess I would rather have a company at least be doing something and be on a journey than to have them not even doing anything. Part of the answer, though, to your question is that over time, I think that increasingly consumers will demand this, right? Like, it's not going to be a case of you're going to be able to get away with it. And you can actually see a big shift right now. The XRB, which sets the financial standards for New Zealand. I'm on the XRB advisory panel, just meeting with them every once in a while and talking about what the people in the room are seeing. And what they've done is introduce these climate reporting standards for the top 100 companies in New Zealand. So this is the big end, you know, like the multi-million, maybe billion-dollar companies, you know, they're massive companies. The top 100 in New Zealand, they're going to need to start reporting on climate change and how it's impacting on them as a company. So it's not hard to foresee, you know, I don't have to be too much of a prophet to say at some point in the future, I can imagine that that will filter down to all companies need to report on this. And not only that, maybe we'll require reporting on how is your company impacting on climate change, like the standard that direction as well. So I guess part of the answer is I think it's coming. I view this as a wave. It's not a tsunami, but think of this picture, right? If you're at the beach and it's low tide and you're standing out at low tide, if you stand there long enough, the water's going to rise and rise and rise. And at some point, you might be swimming, you know, if you're that far out. And in the same way, what I'm seeing is lots of symptoms of greater societal change. So benefit corporations, you know, the rise of private accreditations like that, B Corp, impact investing, you know, the conception that it's not just about financial returns, it's about the impact of the group that I've invested into. You look at Section 131 of the Companies Act. So this was something Duncan Webb proposed, a greater conception of the duties of directors. It may not get through, but it's interesting that it was proposed that directors have to consider the treaty, you know, the environment, employees. So these are all examples of shifts that are going on. And I guess part of the answer is it doesn't happen instantly. And I take great comfort from the fact that in 2019, I got the opportunity to work with the Akina Foundation, who've been doing amazing mahi and work for a very long time. And we, together with some other co-authors, did a report on the future of business, which I can send the link to if anyone's interested. And at the time, we thought, oh, great, well, there's going to be instant change. But of course, it didn't happen that way. But now I talk to people 4 years later in government and other places, and they're like, yeah, I know that report. So, you know, there's no instant change, but it's incremental. And over time, my hope would be in 10 years, we look back and say, wow, the needle has really shifted on all of these things.
What do you think that's going to take in terms of shifting that needle? And you've talked about it already earlier tonight, where you've said that things can change and have changed and will change over time in history, as we've already seen in the past. But for the present, I think this is the trap that we are sort of stuck in, particularly within the for good or climate space, when we're saying we don't want to just greenwash or social wash or those sorts of things, but we want to move into that space. That because there's going to be immediate pain for people who are shifting into that space potentially without systems and structures in place to support them in that place when we're in that transitionary phase, but also that the impact is a long fuse, big bang type of thing. So we have to start the fuse at some point, and we're starting to see some signs, as you've mentioned, getting that started. But because there's no immediate reward, and we are a consumer society who is set up for immediate rewards. We look at the advancement of technology and things like TikTok and Snapchat, and really, really short pieces of information that we're consuming, and a lot of things. I could probably go on and on, but yeah. So how do we hold in this space, and what are your thoughts in that in the now?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I take great comfort from the next generation. So I think if any of you have done any interviews with graduates recently, usually the final question, do you have any questions for us or something? It's usually around like, well, what impact will my career have here? Or, what are you doing about climate change? Or, like there's an awareness that just isn't there if you went back to the 80s or 90s when the final question might have been, so do I get a company car with this position? Like there's a mindset shift that's happening. So I take great comfort from that. And I notice in the chat, people are asking about, but incremental change, it's slow. Do we need to move faster? I guess one of the things is that we're so focused on immediate, like we live in a culture of immediacy. I want to click it and I want to see the video right now. And I think we have to realize that for true change that has deep and pervasive roots, it's just going to take a little bit longer than the instant switch that could be done. So I guess part of it is taking people on the journey with you. And if each of the people on this call are listening to this audio later, if each of them has conversations and then they have conversations, and like, I think it needs to build. And that's why I love the work that you're doing in the programs that you're offering, because you're forcing people to think about this stuff. And, you're thinking about what does change mean and how do we implement it? So I wish I had a switch that would, change everything tomorrow, but that's just not realistic. I think to get it through, what we're going to need is some people in power who are willing to put their hands up and see beyond a 3-year electoral cycle and stand up for some deeper principles that are maybe not going to be popular. And that's the problem. But that's kind of what we need. We need leaders who are willing to take us. But then the other part is that each of you are consumers. So what are you buying? And how are you making that choice? Because I would rather that Etique, what Brianne West founded, looking at the getting rid of plastic bottles and shampoo containers, like that's a simple way when you're shopping, what are you buying? And that's going to send a clear message to even the most capitalistic person that actually there's a positive role to be played if we change how we're acting as a company, because consumers are going to follow us or they're going to stop buying from us unless we change.
Yeah, so true. And there's so many things that we can do as individuals, and I think that's something that we discuss a lot, particularly within our programs, is in terms of your own locus of control and the decisions that you can make in order to enable change in your spaces and places. And sometimes you're powerless, but you can still ask the questions and you can still put it out there. And we've wandered a little bit into the territory of the political football, but being election year, we'll try and keep it away from that. But what do you see as the role of the government in this shift and change? Because obviously with systems change, we need multiple levels and multiple levers being shifted in order to create a new system. So what do you see as a need for our future governments?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's kind of, you'll know what I'm about to say, right? Like we need leadership from government to embrace this concept that we as a country could actually lead the world, and not in a cliche way, but actually in making a real change. And the change, what I've outlined, like requiring companies to outline their impact and their purpose and report on it, like that would be quite unusual. It would be quite different. And therefore, it would set us apart from what other countries have tried. So I don't have anything more simple than that to say, is that we need leadership from government, because ultimately they're the ones who pass the laws. But at a citizen level, at a movement level, each of us have a role to play. And certainly my hope in my life, I view my role to be a catalyst for impact. So I can't make all the changes, but I can help the people who set up charities or businesses that are able to have impact. So if each of you listening has that same attitude, how can I be a catalyst for impact? Then that's going to change the conception. And I wanted to share something with you, which I thought was quite inspirational for me. This is from Barcelona. So some of you may have been there, and you've been maybe to the Sagrada Familia, which is a church. It's the reason I hold this up. This is just like a sculpture of a bit of the church. And you've probably heard the term Gaudi, right? Like it's Gaudi-esque. So Antonin Gaudi was the designer. And when he was designing the Sagrada Familia, this church, way back in the 1870s, he started building it, and he died, I think it was about 1925. And it's been an intergenerational project. So they're predicting that we'll finish by the end of this decade. So think about that. You know, the person who designed it didn't live to see the end. And sometimes I worry about the state of things, and I worry, like the people in the chat, that it's too slow. But I also think that sometimes our lives need to be spent in a way that I may not see the change. I hope I do, but I might not. But I can be one little link. I can be one of the builders adding another brick to this building. And the thing about this, this building is that it's now been going through that intergenerational, you know, the bigger vision of what we're aiming for. It's not just let's get it done within 3 years or 5 years. It's we're going to make it the most beautiful thing that we can. And when I think about Gaudi and what he was trying to do, if you see the church, you'll see it's just like completely different to anything you've ever seen as a building, as a structure. Leave aside anything about religion, like it's just a really cool building. And I think about that, and I think about the fact, you know, that when it comes to building something, we have to have a vision of what we're aiming for. So if he had built a normal church, it would have been done very quickly, on time. Would it have gotten any visitors today if it was just a normal church? No. But this church is visited by more than 5 million people every year. So the bigger vision of what was possible, like if we could reimagine business here in New Zealand with a vision of what it could become, and we could trailblaze it, then we would get much more impact than simply another version of what's been done elsewhere in the world. So that's kind of my vision, and I'll just play one little part of that, and each of you can play a part too.
Yeah, I think that's a really great example, and a really good way to sort of visualize the impact that we can have as an individual, but also as a collective. And I think just going back to the government aspect of that, we need a social mandate in order for any of the policies to actually action as part of it. So if we're not behind it, and we've got some controversial things being put in front of us, controversial with the inverted commas here, but you know, averse to change, to get people on board, it's the many that make that change. And I think that's that's why that's such a good example. And I guess in terms of some of the learnings, you mentioned that we need to learn from best practices across the globe. And so how do you envisage that happening, and what sort of approaches might we take to harness some of those potential benefits of doing so?
Yeah, well, we started the process with that report in 2019. So we interviewed 25 social enterprises using that terminology. And the report took us 9 months to write. So we were very in-depth and thorough. If you have a look at it, it's like 80, 90 pages. And Dr. Jane Horan was the lead researcher and author, with some of us supporting. So that's the level of depth that we need to be, the rigor that we need to be using when it comes to this. So I would be saying we need to be looking at the legislation in all the countries around the world where they've adopted B Corp style structures, the community interest company structures. Go translate the Italian version and the French version and be looking at those, and then conceiving, okay, what does it mean here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in particular with the Te Ao Māori perspective, like what could we create here, learning from all these other places? So yeah, it's quite a big project, but if there was a private members bill put forward by an MP, and if there was resources devoted to it, then I don't see why it would be possible.
Yeah, thought for yeah to chew over a little bit more, I guess in that sense, I'd like to just unpack a little bit around some of the barriers that you might see right now. We've talked about a few of them, but if we really look at and zoom in on the environmental, social, governance factors and corporate decision making, what's in place now and how would you see that shifting?
You mean specifically around ESG and companies?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are terms that are used too loosely at the moment, I think. I do quite a lot with the Institute of Directors, and that was one of the themes that came through in their recent leadership conference in May. I wrote a summary of it. It was a 2-day conference, and they had sessions on environmental, social governance. And yeah, I guess it's just, we've got to get beyond the box ticking exercise of, we've got this section of our report about ESG and integrating it into the business itself. One of the comments I saw, someone was saying, we just need to get on and start the companies. And I think there's a lot of wisdom there, because if we can start companies that are doing things differently and we can prove that they work, then more people are going to want to do that as well. So you entrepreneurs out there, like, I totally encourage you to do this. But when you're doing it, think about the impact and the purpose and how you're telling your story, and bake it into the heart of your company rather than having it be an add-on little ESG component. And as a practical example of this, like, I want to give a really concrete illustration. So a couple of years ago, I was involved in helping set up a company called Community Finance. I'm actually the chair of the board at the moment, and our focus is social housing. We got massive need in this country, right? There's 26,000 people or so on the emergency housing list. So what we're doing in that, as an impact company, is connecting philanthropic funders and investors with the opportunity to build social housing. So in a way, we're the dating app in the middle, and we've targeted and been able to talk with and get funding from KiwiSaver funders like Generate, Pathfinder, and Simplicity. And we've worked with social housing providers like the Salvation Army or Court up in Auckland. So when I start talking about this example, because it's a real example, like, I'm not just making this stuff up, that company, you might think, oh, well, you've probably raised like what, 100,000 or 200,000. Actually, we just ticked over 120 million in funding that we've raised for social housing. So it's a real life example of a company, a finance company, which is doing things very different to the mainstream banks and the mainstream finance companies, because ultimately we're very clear on our mission, which is to provide housing for people who need it. And so that business structure is modeling a new way of conceiving finance. So we're hoping other people will now look at it and go, well, we could try that, because it is successful.
So what's stopping? What are the barriers? What's stopping the adoption and growth of impact-driven enterprises in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand?
Unfortunately, I think it's still the lack of imagination and the binary way of thinking that if I'm going to do good, it's got to be charitable. So I'm not going to do that. And that's what I'm trying to encourage is hybrid models or models that bake in impact and purpose at their core. Yeah, but this is why I do the podcast. Like I've literally talked with hundreds of people about their businesses. Like the latest one, just to give it a sample, Ben Scales, he's essentially in his early 20s. He's doing amazing things. He just graduated from University of Canterbury in product design. His company is called Kiwi Fiber. So I'm a lawyer with my other hat. So I just helped them raise $1.8 million for their startup. And what are they doing? They are reinventing the use of harakiki flax. So it's taking what was a traditional product. And in fact, if you go back to the 1850s and 60s, it was the leading export from Aotearoa, New Zealand, because it's such a unique product. So, but this startup is saying, how can we use the harakiki in a sustainable way to make products that will replace plastic-based materials? So, you know, that interview is just one example of that it can happen. There are examples out there of people doing things differently.
Awesome. And do you see a lot of moving together, as in businesses starting to collaborate and create more positive impacts? And do you see this growing in the future?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's how we learn, is by seeing other examples and learning from each other. I think there's a real movement in this direction. I do quite a bit of work with startup programs. So in here in Otautaki Christchurch, we've got Ministry of Awesome, and in Wellington, Creative HQ. And I've worked with both of those on some of their startup programs. And the interesting thing is that they'll tell you, like, they're running a program and most of the companies, or a lot of the companies, have impact and purpose at their core. So I think it is a movement which is gathering, and I'm just glad I can be one little part of that, helping to tell stories and hopefully get people to question. I mean, my main question is, hopefully some of you disagree with everything I'm saying, but you go away and you think about it and you start to wonder, you know, like, oh, what could it be? Sometimes I'll be on a plane with someone, you know, and having a conversation, it ends up they're a CEO of a big company, and I'll throw in some of these challenges and I hope that they go away and think about it, because, you know, that's how change happens.
Yeah, and I think about some of the things that you're throwing out there in terms of the challenges and how things could be done differently or seen differently. And I can still feel and hear in the spaces that we're within social impact and on the ground, that it's really painful, a lot of the changes, and particularly when it becomes really difficult to sustain the business, or that you might have to go in a different direction. So I guess coming back to that balance between impact, profitability, and sustainability, do you have any sort of tips or suggestions in terms of how we might engage, particularly for the small businesses as well? Because New Zealand is a country that has a number of small businesses and a lot of self-employment and at that level as well, rather than the big corporates that we see elsewhere.
Well, I guess it's a simple piece of advice, but don't try to change everything tomorrow. Just choose one thing or one little thing, you know, one aspect of your business. Or, I mean, the simplest thing that I'm advocating is, what is your purpose? What is your impact? Write it down in 3 bullet points. I want to know what you do. And even for some companies, that will be quite challenging, honestly. So that's a start. What I try to do is talk with metaphors and pictures. So I had a good one the other day from Israel Cooper, who's been on my podcast before. And he said, we've got to get away from thinking about money the way that we've traditionally thought about it. Money is vital for a business in the same way that blood is vital for a human body. But you don't want to have too much blood, right? You're going to die if you have too much blood, and you don't want to have too little blood. there's a certain point where the amount of money and the amount of blood is the right amount. So I guess there's dangers of both sides, right? Like you've got to get the right, because I'm not advocating that there's no profit. I'm advocating that profit equals sustainability. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a really great point, and I think that it's something that we need to keep talking about more and more, because a lot of the smaller businesses who might not get it right, or even the larger businesses who don't get it right straight away, the fact that they're trying to move into that space, there's got to be a little bit of, I guess, just grace in some aspects in that human world, but it's, I guess, tainted with those companies who are just trying to pull the wool over and make a quick buck. And again, I guess it comes back to society and the way that we are exposed to what we know, how we check, where we buy our products from, understanding supply chains and all of those things. It's kind of a new language, or it's a language that's only developing, well, has been around for a while, but it's only becoming more mainstream. So I guess just in terms of how we, again, come back to our individual trajectory and our choices and whether we buy in or not. And it's really interesting. I had a chat with someone who's quite influential in different spaces, and they're like, well, I'm yet to be convinced. Until I'm convinced, I'm not going to change my thinking. And so therein lies quite a problem that we have. We've got people who are really, really invested in the change and in the impact in the full good space. And then we've got a lot of people who are on the fence, and just like a lot of change, you talk about waves and you talk about the different levels. So I guess it's quite a complex space and place to be.
Yeah, the interesting thing is for that person, when they go home and they're talking with their 15-year-old daughter, I bet you that they're going to get challenged. And that's quite interesting to me, because I've got children and I see their perception and the way that they're thinking and looking at the world. So actually, as the generations change, I think there will be shifts as well. And one of the things that I want to issue as a challenge, which has been a challenge for me recently, is that each of us should be working on projects where there's the potential for failure, right? And that's okay. And I think too often we're only focused on things that we're sure will be successes, or we're taking the easy way. But actually in our lives, we should always be trying to build in something that might just fail completely. And yet we're pushing the boundaries in some way and learning from that. And I think that's a mindset shift that would help. Like if each of us had projects we were doing, and this is really real for me right now, because I'm about to publish a children's book, which is a picture book called The Apple Tree. So I didn't draw the illustrations. I got someone who's amazing at drawing. I wrote the little short story, but I'm about to hit print with the Caxton Press down here, 4,000 copies. And it might be an abject failure, but on the other hand, it might lead to different conversations and opportunities. So I'm willing to take the risk of the failure in order to open up doors that otherwise would be closed. And I like that conception, or that way of thinking, that for each of us, we should be always having something that might just not work, but I'm going to try it anyway.
Awesome. Well, I'm just looking at the time, and I'd really love to get our audience involved. And if we've got any questions from the floor about anything that we've discussed tonight, Steven's here, and I'm quite happy to answer any questions you might have. So feel free to take yourselves off mic and throw a question out there.
Hey, Stephen, I've got a great question. No, I haven't. Great presentation. Thank you. I've got a question. Get that right. It seems, listening to you talking, that there would be a direct correlation between some of these ideas, like, for example, having a constitution, or having a written, sense of purpose and what that actually means in quite practical terms. That there would be a direct correlation between that practice and the longevity or sustainability of businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Because I think, a lot of, particularly in the SME area, where, as we know, the data tells us that failure is horrific from a percentage point of view. I mean, like 60% have gone before 10 years. What you're suggesting, I suspect, is a really significant step towards a foundation of sustainability and longevity.
Well, so I deal with startups, SMEs, and people founding their business all the time. And one of my first questions to them is this sort of, what are you here for? Because I think too many people don't think about it well and don't think about the money side, the sustainability side. So I agree. My hope would be that if they did do this, that they're actually setting themselves up really, really well. Because part of the problem with SMEs and small startups is that they are not telling their story well. And therefore, they're not finding the market that they fit in, and they're not pivoting to where they need to be. So yeah, I would hope that this is a positive help. And the other thing is that people can start, like literally, we could have created companies while I've been talking. Like, it's that simple. And so there is something to be said for providing some form of education. You know, like, what is governance? What is management? Those aren't things that were taught in school or anywhere. So is there a role to be said for actually helping people before they hit click, register the company, you know, to be supporting them? That's why I always try to be a mentor on startup programs, because I want to get people adopting the right documents that they need for the future, because so many people just have no idea. So yeah, thank you for your comment, though. That's really good.
Thank you. Great idea, having the Constitution. Great idea. We used to have them years ago.
Yeah, that's right. And this is where history repeats itself, right? The way, if in case people are interested, they used to be called articles of association, and you used to have to say what you were in business for. And what happened is that it became a way for you to list every possible thing under the sun that you were in business for. And therefore it became meaningless, because it was simply, you know, we lease property and we sell products and we employ people, and it was just meaningless. So what I'm proposing, though, is a more refined, focused purpose. Kind of similar, if you think about charities, like there's 28,000 registered charities. Before they can become registered, they have to define their purpose and they have to articulate it. And there's actually a vetting which happens, which is, you didn't define your purpose well enough, return to sender. So there's a balance here, because I don't want to, like someone said in the chat, I don't want to have too much compliance, you know, but equally, I think it would set people up well for the future. So have a read of that Akina report. I think it summarizes some of this really well. I'll try and put it in the chat, actually.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brett. Do we have any other questions from the floor?
The answer to Joe is, it's called Kiwi Fiber. Kiwi Fiber. They're the latest episode on an excellent podcast called Seeds, right? So I put the links to everything that they do in that episode as well. I'll just put this Akina report in the chat. The other thing around community, just to throw it in there, I'm really active on LinkedIn. And so that's another way to build community, you know, as a group of people who are interested. So I would welcome connecting with you all, because that's somewhere that we can post ideas and new concepts and things. Like, let's look for platforms where we can do that.
Well, while you're thinking of any other questions, I do have another one, of course. But like so we're talking about a paradigm shift, and we're saying that there's one starting to happen. How do you see this evolving, particularly around impact over the next 10 years? And what changes do you really anticipate? I mean, we've touched on it a little bit already, but it'd be real nice just to hear some of those things that you're thinking. Well,
I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And if all of you do what you do, maybe we'll have the change, and hopefully it will be more dramatic. I think what I'm hoping is that within the next decade, that I will, so I'm speaking personally, right? Like from my perspective, my hope would be that in 10 years, when we're all sitting around having a glass of wine in the evening somewhere, that we're reminiscing about a decade ago, and I'm able to point to examples of constitutions which changed the way that people thought about business. So the example that I mentioned before, the company exists to serve the earth. That's going to be kind of radical. No one that I know has ever written a constitution like that. So maybe other companies will like it as well. In that constitution, I also talk about stars and wayfinding and the fact that we need new stars to guide our companies by. So that when it's ready, I think the founders of that company are going to be fine with sharing it and letting other people see it. And then on a personal level, I hope that the Seeds podcast will continue to grow. So I've done 356 conversations. This will be 357. I hope by then I'm up to 1,000, like I'm going to keep telling stories and keep working. I've got a conference which I'm implementing now. It's going to happen on October the 5th. So that's called the Seeds Impact Conference. There's going to be 27 sessions running over one day in 4 different Zoom rooms, 1 room just devoted to community, and then 3 rooms with amazing speakers, including Francis Valentine, who many of you will know. So that's going to be another little thing that I'm starting, and I hope it will gather momentum over the time. And it'll just become like a yearly fixture, all online. The massive charge of $20 to attend the whole day. So just covering costs, and things. But that's another example of something that I hope will grow beyond me as an individual and will become something that just gets in the calendar that, yeah, I'm going to go along to that. So that's kind of personally what I'm doing. And then I just wrote an article with 2 Canterbury University professors about the role of nature as an entity, because as you know, in the Wanganui River, we've got Taranaki Maunga. There's different examples of legal entities being formed. So I'll share the link to that with you all as well, because I'm going to keep pushing boundaries of what's possible with legal structures.
That's really cool. Thank you for that. And yeah, that conference looks amazing, and looking forward to seeing if we can get along there and get people continuing in this sort of conversation, because that's kind of what it's all about in terms of starting to make real change across the society. So I really, thank you for doing what you're doing in that sort of space. I guess just unless there are any other questions from the floor, I just want to make sure everyone's had their chance to ask Steven while he's here.
I think we kind of answered most of them, or at least referred to them as they came up. I was trying to keep an eye a little bit on, what was going on.
Yeah, I think so too. So I guess just giving you the opportunity, Steven, just to reimagine business for a second. What will it look like from your perspective if we do these things in 100 years?
Yeah, well, that would be my hope, is that I guess it would be my great-grandchildren or my great-great-grandchildren are actually in an environment where each business is conceiving of itself not with a focus on profit and how much it can return to shareholders, but instead on the role that it's playing within the society, and in a way that is considering all levels of stakeholders, from customers, suppliers, the environment, iwi, it's got a much bigger conception of the role of the company, and that companies are very clear on the purpose and the impact that they're set up for. That's sort of the vision of what I would hope companies are moving towards. And then I really hope that it's not just a subset of companies, that it's, those couple hundred or thousands or whatever companies. It's actually become so ingrained in our culture that we look back and go, how did they not know that this was where we were going to get to? Because the culture has shifted so much. And the reason I have hope for that is that if you look at, and it's kind of a silly example, okay, but I'm old enough to remember in the late 1980s, if you got on an airplane, it was filled with smoke, because so many people were smoking. In fact, it was built into the architecture of an airplane. Right in your seat, there was a little thing you flipped and you could put your ashes in it. Like, it was promoting smoking. So I've seen that shift in my lifetime, from smoke-filled cabins in airplanes to you can't smoke at all. So change is possible, and in a relatively short time, you know. So I do take comfort from the fact that if we can see the benefits of it, in that case, our health, right? And think of the secondhand smoke that we all had way back in the day. So it is possible to have change. And therefore, I think that we need to try with every fiber within us to push for that positive impact. Because one of the things that drives me is, at the end of my life, when I'm hopefully 85 or 90 or whatever it ends up being, I want to look back and say, wow, you gave everything that you could to having positive impact. So I'm 47 right now as we're talking, right? Like, I'm not going to be doing this forever, but I have energy and I have time, and I'm not watching lots of Netflix, and I'm doing as much impact and change focused work as I possibly can. And my hope would be that the next generation of lawyers realizes that they can have that sort of impact as well. And all of you as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, what a beautiful kōrero, and just love the passion that you have. I hope you've enjoyed the tables being turned a little bit in terms of kind of being interviewed for your own podcast, but hopefully your audience enjoy hearing a little bit more about what you think and how you think things should drive forward, and what is really possible in the future, and some of those things that we all can do in our own locus of control to support that change. And every little thing that we do does add up. So we might pause the conversation there, and I will hand back over to Jana just to take us through the last little piece that we have. If you're interested in more of these types of conversations, some of you I can already recognize as current or past students, which is lovely to have you within the space. But if you are interested in Academy X, Jana, it's all yours.
Love it. Thank you, Hansine. Thank you, Stephen. That was such an interesting discussion. I really liked your analogy about that church. Like, if it had been a regular church that he built, then no one would visit it today or pay any mind. But because it took that extra time, that extra purpose behind it, that is still something pretty amazing. Yeah, really resonated with me. So thank you. I won't take up much more of everyone's time. But just want to quickly introduce you, if you don't already know, if you like this kind of conversation and want to continue to have conversations like this, then we have 2 Changemaker programs, postgraduate certificate in leading change for good, and the Master of Change in Organizational Resilience. In short, leading changes for people who want to gain the skills to effectively lead change, initiate change. And MCOR, Master of Change in Organizational Resilience, is for those who just want to take it a step further and really learn how to navigate and how to master change. So you can stack leading change towards MCOR. They're all designed to be part-time for people who are working, who want to implement the things that they're learning as they go. This is our last intake of Leading Change for Good, starting in August for all of 23 and all of 2024 as well. We're not going to be offering it next year, so if you're keen, now's your time to get on board. We have an upcoming event, if you want to learn more about them, happening next week. I'll send out the details tomorrow for anyone who's interested, but just a little drop-in info session, ask your questions, here's some of the key details. I'll quickly pass to Lisa just to introduce herself, our wonderful outreach manager. You'll go to if you have any questions at all.
Kia ora, ka pai, Jana. Beautiful to see everyone tonight. Ka pai is Stephen. I have been lucky enough to go on the Leading Change for Good journey, and recognise a lot of people here tonight. It's a special journey where you're working towards a strategy of change, which is of your choice. It's your leadership journey, it's authenticity, it's sustainability, it's the tools, framework, system change and more, and kaupapa Maori values and approaches. And which leads on to our Master of Change in Organisational Resilience, which is you're working towards a project of change where you implement change, which is the rubber meets the road. So, and it's of your choice. And I'm here to help if you have any questions at all. We have 4 scholarships available. Kia ora.
Thanks, Lisa. Back to you, Hansine.
Yeah, so just want to thank Steven once more. Really appreciate your time and effort that's been put into this research, the kōrero, and taking us through. So, and thanks to everybody who has also joined and contributed to tonight as well. So, as I open with karakia, I will close the session with karakia so that I'll let you go back into your places and spaces tonight. And if you're traveling, please travel safely. So. Ka whakaere te tapu, ke wātia te ara, ke tura ki whakataha ai, ke tura ki whakataha ai, haumie, huie, tae ki e. Thanks everyone.